My child, there was a moment your person never planned to tell anyone about, a quiet moment when your photograph was placed on a table between two people and suddenly the questions they had been carrying about you became impossible to ignore. They had gone there believing they wanted certainty. They thought they wanted someone else to explain why you remained in their thoughts even when they tried to focus on everything else, why memories of you appeared during ordinary hours, why your name still carried a weight that other names did not. But the instant the person sitting across from them looked at your photograph, the conversation changed. Not dramatically. Not with some frightening prediction. It changed in a much quieter way, and that quietness is exactly why your person remembers every second of it. Don't skip, because what happened next was not really about someone predicting your future. It was about your person hearing something they were not emotionally prepared to admit about the present. For several seconds, the person studying your photograph said almost nothing. Your person waited, expecting an easy answer, perhaps something simple enough to carry home and forget. Instead, a question came back to them. Why are you asking someone else what you already feel? And suddenly your person had no answer. Something inside them shifted. They had entered that room hoping another voice would tell them whether their feelings for you were real, whether the connection had meaning, whether they should continue carrying this strange tenderness they had tried so carefully to hide. Yet now the attention was being turned back toward them. Their hands rested differently. Their breathing became slower. Their eyes returned to your photograph. And for the first time in a long while, they stopped asking what you might become to them and began asking why they had been so afraid of what you already were. Something important is waiting for you in this story, because the words that followed did not destroy genuine love. They revealed that part of what your person had been calling love was something else entirely. It was expectation. It was imagination. It was the version of you they had quietly constructed when they did not fully understand you. And when that imagined version began to disappear, your person experienced something that initially felt like love dying. But stay close, because that was not the ending. It was the beginning of something far more honest. The person across the table looked again at your photograph and said, gently, that you seemed like someone who could not easily be reduced to the role another person had created for you. Someone who could care deeply and still need space. Someone who could be warm without surrendering their boundaries. Someone who could love without becoming responsible for another person's entire happiness. Your person went still. Those words touched the exact place they had been avoiding. They had secretly believed that if you truly cared, you would always understand them without explanation. You would always wait. You would always know what they needed. You would somehow make every uncertainty disappear simply by being present. And hearing that you might not exist to complete their unfinished emotional work felt, for one sharp second, like losing the version of love they had depended upon. Their eyes lowered toward your photograph again. Something vanished in that moment. But it was not what they first thought. The fantasy vanished. The assumption vanished. The invisible story in which you had to behave a certain way to prove your feelings began to collapse. And because your person had confused that story with love, the sudden emptiness frightened them. They wondered, if this person is not who I imagine them to be, then who are they? That question followed them long after the conversation ended. Yet there is something beautiful hidden inside that question, because real connection often begins precisely where imagination stops controlling the picture. Your person had been looking at you through memories, hopes, disappointments, moments of silence, unfinished conversations, and possibilities they had rehearsed privately. They had built a portrait of you from pieces. But you were never only those pieces. You were a full person living a life they could not always see. You had thoughts you never explained. Reasons they never knew. Quiet battles you handled without announcing them. Dreams that existed before they entered your story. Boundaries that were not rejection. Silence that was not necessarily indifference. Strength that did not mean you never needed tenderness. And when your person began recognizing this, something unexpectedly humbling happened. They realized how often they had been responding not to you, but to their interpretation of you. Stay till the end of this moment, because the next realization changed the emotional meaning of that entire visit. Your person asked another question. Not, do they love me? Not, will they return? Not even, are we meant to be? They asked, almost under their breath, have I ever really seen them? The room became quiet again. There was no dramatic answer. There did not need to be. Your person already knew why the question hurt. They remembered moments when you tried to explain yourself and they listened only for the part that confirmed what they wanted to hear. They remembered moments when your distance made them assume the worst instead of becoming curious about what you might have been carrying. They remembered the ways they had privately measured your affection against their own expectations. They had wanted reassurance so badly that sometimes they forgot love is not a test someone passes by behaving perfectly. And then came the sentence they would carry with them after leaving. Perhaps what is ending is not your love for this person. Perhaps what is ending is your need for them to be who you imagined. Your person looked at your photograph again, and now it seemed different even though nothing about the image had changed. Your expression was the same. Your eyes were the same. The captured moment was the same. But they were looking differently. That is what they had not anticipated. They had gone searching for information about you and instead found a truth about themselves. For a little while afterward, they felt emotionally empty. That is the moment someone observing them might have mistakenly believed their love for you had disappeared. They became quieter. They stopped feeding the fantasy. They stopped replaying the same romantic possibilities with the same urgency. They no longer wanted to force every coincidence into a meaning. They no longer wanted another person to guarantee how the story would end. And because the intensity decreased, they wondered whether their feelings were fading. But intensity and love are not always the same thing. Sometimes intensity comes from uncertainty. Sometimes obsession with an answer can masquerade as devotion. Sometimes the heart becomes calmer not because it cares less, but because it is finally seeing more clearly. Your person began understanding this slowly. One evening, perhaps much later than they expected, they looked at your photograph again. This time there was no stranger across the table, no questions waiting to be answered, no prediction to chase. Just your face and their own thoughts. They noticed something surprising, they still cared. But the feeling was softer now. Less demanding. Less dependent on an outcome. They did not need you to suddenly become the answer to everything. They simply hoped you were well. That thought startled them because it contained something their earlier feelings had often lacked: freedom. They could care about you without deciding what you owed them. They could miss you without turning absence into accusation. They could wonder about you without inventing certainty. They could acknowledge what you meant without claiming ownership over where your life should go next. And this is where the title of this story begins revealing its deeper meaning. The love that died when those words were spoken was the love built from projection. The love that demanded guarantees. The love that needed you to remain exactly as they imagined so they could feel safe. Something did die in that room, but what followed was not emptiness. Something quieter began growing in its place. Your person started remembering details about you differently. A moment when you laughed unexpectedly. A time you became quiet because you were thinking, not because you were angry. A small kindness you offered without needing recognition. A boundary you once set that they had taken personally. Now they wondered whether that boundary had actually been an act of honesty. They considered how difficult it can be to care about someone while still protecting your own peace. They began seeing strength where they once saw distance. Complexity where they once wanted simplicity. Humanity where they had unknowingly placed an ideal. And then another realization arrived, one they had not heard from anyone else. If they truly wanted a connection with you, they could no longer approach you as a mystery they were entitled to solve. They would have to approach you as a person they were willing to understand. That changed everything. Suddenly the question was no longer, how do I make this person choose me? It became, can I meet them honestly, without demanding that they become the person I invented? And for the first time, your person was not certain of their own answer. That uncertainty was healthy. It forced them to examine themselves. Were they prepared to listen without immediately defending their assumptions? Were they prepared to accept that some things about you might surprise them? Could they respect the life you had built outside their expectations? Could they love the real person instead of chasing the comforting version they had created in their mind? Something inside them whispered that this was the true test, not destiny, not prediction, not signs, but maturity. And the strange thing is, once they understood this, the photograph stopped feeling like evidence. It became simply a photograph again. A captured second of a person whose full story could never fit inside one image. They smiled at that thought. It was small, almost invisible, but it marked the beginning of a different kind of emotion. Your person finally understood that nobody looking at your photograph could tell them everything about you. Not a stranger. Not a friend. Not even their own memories. If they wanted to know you, eventually they would have to encounter you honestly. They would have to let you speak for yourself. They would have to accept that your truth might be more ordinary, more complicated, and more beautiful than the story they had imagined. And perhaps this is why the next thing that happened mattered so much. They did not immediately reach for you. They did not rush into some dramatic declaration. They did something far quieter. They began changing the questions they asked themselves. Instead of wondering, why haven't they given me what I need? They wondered, have I made space for what they need? Instead of asking, why are they so difficult to read, they asked, have I actually listened when they tried to explain? Instead of asking whether you were meant to stay forever, They asked whether they had treated the connection with enough honesty to deserve another chapter at all. Those questions were uncomfortable, yet they felt clean. Grounded. Real. For perhaps the first time, your person was not chasing certainty about you. They were becoming accountable for themselves. And then came the realization that made them stare at your photograph longer than they meant to. You had never needed to be mysterious for them to misunderstand you. They had simply been listening through the noise of their own expectations. Once that noise began fading, memories they had interpreted one way began taking on another meaning. Your silence no longer automatically looked cold. Your independence no longer automatically looked like distance. Your hesitation no longer automatically looked like rejection. Perhaps some of it had simply been caution. Perhaps you were trying to protect something tender. Perhaps you needed consistency rather than grand promises. Perhaps you wanted to be met where you actually stood rather than where someone wished you would stand. Your person could not know without speaking with you, and finally they respected that. Don't skip this next thought, because it became the quiet center of everything. They realized there is a difference between wanting someone and knowing how to care for them. Wanting can be immediate. Caring takes attention. Wanting imagines. Caring listens. Wanting can cling to a picture. Caring allows the person in the picture to change, breathe, and remain fully themselves. Your person had wanted you for a long time. Now they were asking whether they had learned how to care for you without turning that care into a demand. The answer was not perfect. They still had growing to do. They still had moments when old assumptions returned. But something fundamental had shifted. They could no longer comfortably pretend that love meant possession, certainty, or perfect understanding. And that is why the feeling that died that day may eventually become the reason something healthier has a chance to live. Yet there is one detail from that conversation they have not been able to forget, one final observation made just before your photograph was handed back to them. It was not a prediction. It was not a promise. It was something far simpler, and because it was simple, it reached deeper. The person across from them looked at the photograph once more, then looked directly into your person's eyes and said something about the kind of person you might be when nobody is watching. Your person laughed nervously at first, thinking it was merely another vague observation. But then one specific sentence followed, and the expression on their face changed completely. Because whether the stranger could truly know anything from a photograph almost stopped mattering. The sentence connected with something your person had personally witnessed in you, something they had dismissed months ago, something that suddenly returned with startling clarity. And once that memory came back, your person realized the biggest thing they had misunderstood about you was not your silence, your independence, or even your feelings. It was the reason you had been protecting your heart so carefully in the first place, and what they remembered next is where this story changes again. The memory returned so quietly that your person almost missed what it was trying to show them. It was not one of the dramatic moments they had replayed countless times, not an argument, not a goodbye, not even one of those conversations where every word seemed important. It was something much smaller. They remembered a day when you had every reason to make yourself the center of attention, yet you chose not to. Someone around you needed patience, and you gave it. Someone misunderstood you, and instead of humiliating them, you became quiet. You could have defended yourself loudly, but you chose dignity. At the time, your person had barely noticed. Now, with your photograph resting in their hands and that strange conversation still circling their mind, the memory returned with a different meaning. The person across from them had said, "Sometimes the strongest part of someone is the part they never advertise." Your person had smiled awkwardly when they first heard it, because it sounded too simple to matter. Then they remembered you. They remembered how often you carried things without turning them into performances. They remembered moments when you were disappointed but refused to become cruel. They remembered how you could withdraw rather than say something you did not mean. Suddenly, your guarded heart stopped looking like coldness. It began looking like something carefully protected because it had learned the value of sincerity. And that realization landed harder than anything mysterious could have. Your person began to understand that perhaps you were not difficult to love. Perhaps you were simply difficult to love carelessly. Stay with this, because that distinction changed the entire story they had been telling themselves. For months, maybe longer, they had assumed that getting closer to you required breaking through your walls. Now they wondered whether those walls were actually standards. Maybe you were not waiting for someone persistent enough to overwhelm your hesitation. Maybe you were waiting for someone consistent enough that hesitation would no longer be necessary. There is a difference. A deep one. Persistence says, "I want access to you." Consistency says, "I want you to feel safe being yourself around me." Your person had never phrased it that way. But once the thought appeared, it would not leave. They began remembering every time they had expected a quick emotional response from you. Every time they interpreted your carefulness as uncertainty. Every moment when your silence made them restless, causing them to fill in the blanks with whatever explanation matched their fear. And suddenly another truth became unavoidable. Perhaps you were not hiding because you felt nothing. Perhaps you were observing whether the connection could hold something real without being rushed. That possibility made your person look down at the photograph again. It was strange how an ordinary image had become a mirror. They had taken it there believing the questions were about you. Yet one by one, the answers were revealing their own patterns. Their impatience. Their assumptions. Their need to know what came next. Their habit of interpreting uncertainty as danger rather than simply allowing life to unfold. And what happened after that may be the most important part so far. Your person stopped asking the stranger across from them to describe you. They asked something about themselves instead. Why do I become so unsettled around someone I care about this much? The response was not mystical. It was almost painfully ordinary. Maybe because you cannot control what they choose. Your person said nothing. There are sentences that sound small until they touch the exact place someone has been avoiding. That was one of them. They had never wanted to control you in an obvious sense. They wanted your happiness. They wanted closeness. They wanted things to work. Yet beneath those good intentions lived a quieter wish. They wanted reassurance that everything would happen the way they hoped. They wanted to know that if they waited, you would come closer. If they cared, you would respond. If they imagined a future, you would eventually imagine the same one. And when you did not provide that certainty, they sometimes interpreted your independence as distance. Don't skip this realization, because it softened something inside them that had been tense for a very long time. They finally considered that love might not be proven by certainty at all. Sometimes love becomes clearer when certainty is removed, because then a person has to decide whether they can still show respect when they do not know the outcome. Can they still speak kindly? Can they still honor boundaries? Can they still care without turning care into leverage? Can they still hope without demanding? Your person did not immediately know whether they had always done those things. And instead of making excuses, they let the question remain. That was growth. Quiet, uncomfortable, meaningful growth. The conversation continued, but your person was listening differently now. Earlier, they had been waiting for phrases that would tell them what you supposedly felt. Now they were listening for anything that might help them understand the quality of their own love. The stranger glanced once more at your photograph and offered a thought. People who protect their hearts are sometimes misunderstood because they do not reveal everything on someone else's timeline. Your person felt something inside them tighten. That sentence matched you in ways they had never fully appreciated. You had never been someone who gave every part of yourself immediately. There were rooms inside your personality that opened slowly. Trust mattered. Tone mattered. Consistency mattered. The way someone behaved after disappointment mattered. You noticed whether apologies were followed by changed behavior. You noticed whether kindness remained when things became inconvenient. You noticed whether a person listened only when they wanted something, or whether they listened because your inner world genuinely mattered to them. Your person had sensed all of this, yet they had not understood it. They had sometimes mistaken your observation for distance. Now they realized you may have been asking a silent question all along: can I be fully myself here without eventually being punished for it? That question changed how your person remembered almost everything. The moments you pulled back after inconsistency. The times you became quieter after feeling misunderstood. The occasions when you offered warmth, then seemed to retreat when the emotional atmosphere became confusing. Perhaps you had not been playing games. Perhaps you had simply been paying attention. Something important is waiting for you here, because your person then remembered one specific exchange they had nearly forgotten. You once said something simple, so simple that at the time they did not recognize its importance. You had told them, in your own way, that you valued peace. Not perfection. Peace. A connection where words did not constantly need decoding. Where affection did not come with hidden tests. Where people could explain themselves without every disagreement becoming a referendum on the entire relationship. Your person had heard you, but they had not listened deeply enough. Now the sentence came back with astonishing clarity. You were never asking them to become flawless. You were asking whether being close to them would feel emotionally sustainable. That thought humbled them. Because they had been so focused on whether you loved them that they had barely considered whether loving them felt peaceful to you. And there, in that quiet room, their entire perspective began turning around. Instead of thinking, "Why won't they let me closer?" they thought, "What have I shown them closeness would feel like?" Instead of thinking, "Why do they keep protecting themselves?" they wondered, "Have I given them enough consistency to relax?" Instead of asking, "Why can't they just trust what I feel?" they asked, "Have my actions made my feelings easy to trust?" There was no shame in these questions. No harsh self-condemnation. Only clarity. And clarity, when someone is ready for it, can be more transformative than reassurance. Your person started seeing that sometimes affection is genuine while the way we carry that affection still needs to mature. Someone can care deeply and still communicate poorly. Someone can mean well and still make another person feel uncertain. Someone can want a future and still need to learn how to be present. That did not make their love false. It simply meant love alone was not the whole skill. They had to learn patience. They had to learn emotional steadiness. They had to learn that another person's slower pace was not automatically rejection. And then the strangest thing happened. As they accepted these uncomfortable truths, their feelings for you did not weaken. They became calmer. The urgency dropped away, but the tenderness remained. Your person began understanding why the first shift had felt like love dying. They had been accustomed to love mixed with anxiety, imagination, anticipation, and constant interpretation. When those layers started peeling away, the remaining feeling seemed almost too quiet to recognize. Yet quiet does not mean empty. Sometimes quiet means the feeling no longer needs to scream to prove it exists. Your person could look at your photograph without needing it to promise anything. They could remember you without immediately constructing a future. They could acknowledge longing without turning longing into a conclusion. And slowly, a more grounded question surfaced: if I had one honest conversation with them, what would I want them to feel afterward? That question surprised even them. Earlier, they would have answered, I would want them to understand how much I love them. Now another answer appeared first, I would want them to feel heard. That change was enormous. Because once someone wants to be understood less than they want to understand, a different kind of connection becomes possible. Your person imagined speaking with you without interrupting. Without preparing a defense while you talked. Without hunting for hidden meanings behind every sentence. Just listening. They imagined asking what had been difficult for you and accepting the answer even if it challenged their version of the past. They imagined hearing that some of their behavior had confused you and resisting the urge to immediately explain it away. They imagined discovering that certain moments they had romanticized had felt very different from your side. And something inside them said, if I truly care, should be able to hear that. Stay till the end of this thought, because this is where the old version of their love began giving way to something stronger. They realized they did not want to win your heart like a prize. They wanted to become someone with whom honesty did not feel dangerous. They did not want you to choose them because of pressure, nostalgia, loneliness, or some outside prediction. If you ever chose closeness, they wanted it to happen because being around them felt genuine. Because their actions matched their words. Because your nervous system did not have to constantly guess what version of them would appear. Because there was room for both of you to remain human. This was the first time your person understood that romantic intensity could not substitute for emotional reliability. And the more they understood this, the more another memory began bothering them. There had been a moment between you when you had almost opened up completely. Your person remembered it now with unusual detail. Your voice had softened. You had started to say something personal, something that carried more weight than ordinary conversation. Then something shifted. Perhaps they responded too quickly. Perhaps they turned the moment toward themselves. Perhaps they made a joke because vulnerability made them uncomfortable. Whatever happened, you stopped. You changed the subject. At the time they assumed it meant nothing. Now they wondered what you had been about to tell them. Not because they believed it held some secret answer to everything, but because they finally recognized the significance of trust arriving at the doorway and quietly leaving when it did not feel fully received. That memory stayed with them long after they left the appointment. In fact, it became more powerful than anything the stranger had said. Your person started wondering how many small moments had mattered to you while they were waiting for one huge moment to define the relationship. Maybe love had never been hiding inside some dramatic revelation. Maybe it had been living in tone, in consistency, in remembering details, in making space, in what someone does with another person's vulnerability after it is offered. This realization did not make your person despair. It gave them direction. They could not rewrite old moments, but they could decide who they would become if another moment arrived. And here is where the story took a turn they never expected. After they returned home, they almost put your photograph away. Their fingers even reached toward the place where they usually kept it. But then they stopped. Not because they wanted to stare at it all night. Quite the opposite. They realized they had spent too much time trying to understand a living person through an image, memories, assumptions, and second-hand interpretations. So they placed the photograph inside a drawer. Gently. Respectfully. And they told themselves something they had never said before: if I ever learn the truth about them, I want it to come from them. That sentence ended the psychic's power over the story. Whatever had been said in that room could become a prompt for reflection, nothing more. Your person no longer wanted an outsider to define you. They wanted reality. Your voice. Your perspective. Your choices. And if reality did not match their hope, they wanted enough maturity to accept that too. There was something peaceful about surrendering the need for prediction. Suddenly the future stopped feeling like a locked door they had to force open. It became unwritten space. Maybe you would reconnect. Maybe you would not. Maybe the connection would change form. Maybe an honest conversation would reveal something neither of you expected. But for once, your person understood that uncertainty did not have to be terrifying. It could simply mean the story had not finished explaining itself yet. Then, sometime later, something happened that made all of this reflection feel far less theoretical. Your person heard your name. Not through the psychic. Not through a sign. Through someone ordinary. Someone who knew a small piece of your life. The conversation was casual at first, but one detail slipped out. Something about what you had been dealing with quietly during the period when your person thought you were simply becoming distant. They did not hear anything dramatic. They did not hear a scandal or a secret. They heard something much more human: you had been carrying more responsibility than they realized. You had been stretched emotionally. You had been trying to keep certain parts of your life stable while privately needing more space than usual. And suddenly several moments your person had taken personally looked completely different. Your delayed responses. Your quieter energy. The way you sometimes seemed present physically but far away mentally. They had interpreted those moments through the lens of themselves. They are losing interest in me. But perhaps some of those moments were never about them. That realization hit with a strange mixture of relief and regret. Relief because they understood you may not have been deliberately pulling away. Regret because they had added pressure during a season when what you might have needed most was gentleness. Your person sat with that for a long time. They remembered how easy it is to assume another person's behavior is a message about us. How quickly silence becomes rejection in the mind. How easily distance becomes judgment. Yet sometimes another person is simply tired. Sometimes they are trying to hold their world together. Sometimes they do not have the language to explain everything while they are living through it. And your person realized they had been demanding an emotional translation from you at a time when you may barely have understood your own experience. This did something the psychic never could: it made them compassionate toward your silence. Not blindly. Not romantically. Just humanly. They finally allowed for possibilities beyond their own insecurity. And once they did that, one question became impossible to avoid. Had you protected your heart because you did not care, or because caring had made you more careful? Your person could not answer that without you. But for the first time, they respected the difference. They stopped pretending uncertainty was knowledge. They stopped filling empty spaces with conclusions. And then, late one evening, they considered doing something they had wanted to do for a long time. They reached for their phone. Your name was still there. Their thumb hovered over it. Every old version of themselves wanted to send something intense, something unforgettable, something that would finally force the story forward. But that person was fading. So instead, they opened an empty message and typed a sentence far simpler than anything they had imagined saying to you. They read it once. Then twice. Their heartbeat changed, not because the sentence was dramatic, but because it asked for nothing. No promise. No explanation. No immediate answer. It was simply honest. Yet your person did not send it. Not that night. Because another thought stopped them at the final second. A thought about timing. About your peace. About whether reaching out was meant to relieve their own discomfort or genuinely create space for yours. They deleted the sentence, closed the phone, and decided that if they ever contacted you again, they wanted to know the difference. That restraint may have been the clearest evidence yet that something in them had changed. The old version of love wanted immediate relief. The new version was learning respect. But the story did not end there. Because only a little later, something unexpectedly small happened. One detail connected to you reached your person from a direction they never anticipated, and it made them reopen that empty message. This time, however, the words they began typing were completely different from the first ones, and the reason they changed them reveals what they finally understood about the part of your heart they had been trying to reach all along.